You're trapped in a safe house doing DIY surgery on a mafia boss who just survived a hit squad. Welcome to Alara's terrifying new normal. After Dante took an automatic rifle round for her, she had to bandage his bleeding wounds and stabilize his dislocated shoulder while assassins hunted them down. Covered in his blood, he gave her a final choice to walk away forever, warning her that loving him meant a permanent target on her back. But instead of running, she kissed him.
Picture the exact moment a human mind begins to fracture under an impossible weight. You and I are going to step into this scene together to watch a quiet tragedy unfold. Our focus rests on Ara. She is a waitress who has spent 2 years perfecting the survival art of total invisibility. She floats past the private rooms with hunched shoulders, a ghost in the dim light. But tonight, that fragile illusion shatters. The sharp crack of a dropping crystal glass echoes against the heavy table of Dante Valli, a syndicate boss who dictates life and death with a mere nod. The room completely freezes, bracing for immediate violence. Instead, Dante simply watches her. It reveals a chilling truth about power. A burst of rage is easy to endure, but the quiet, lingering stare of a predator will break your spirit long before he ever lays a hand on you. Ara knew all too well that seeing too much was the quickest way to end up dead. The air inside the restaurant felt incredibly heavy that Tuesday, the lighting unnaturally dim. Marcus, the floor manager, pulled her into the shadows of the narrow hallway. Sweat beaded on his pale forehead. His hands trembling as he explained the private room server had called in sick. Ara had to go in. He grabbed her shoulders, begging her to follow the strict rules of survival. Keep your eyes on the floor. Do not speak. Forget everything you hear. A freezing rush of panic flooded her veins, yet there is a heavy truth we all eventually face in life. Sometimes the most terrifying burdens are forced upon our shoulders at the exact moment we are most desperate to run away. The urge to run screamed in her chest, but the crushing weight of her unpaid bills locked her feet firmly to the floor. Ara swallowed her terror and picked up the tray. Looking through the frosted kitchen window, she watched the guests slowly take their seats. 6 men with cold, calculating eyes, 1 woman wearing a sharp red dress, and right in the center sat Dante Valli. You could clearly see the raw power in his posture. The others sat inches away from him, completely trapped within his dark orbit. He did not have to raise his voice or demand respect. The space simply warped around his very presence. It reminds us of a dark reality in human dynamics. True power never has to shout to make you tremble. It just sits quietly and waits for the entire room to surrender. Beside her, an older line cook muttered Dante's name and crossed himself, as if the devil had just ordered a meal. Ara locked her jaw, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and stepped directly into the lion's den. She kept her eyes glued to the expensive crystal, moving with the stiff grace of a wind-up doll. For an entire hour, she played the perfect ghost. They openly discussed violent crimes, treating her like invisible furniture. She forced her brain to go completely numb. It worked beautifully until her exhausted nerves finally slipped. She looked up, and Dante was already staring right at her. It teaches us a brutal lesson about vulnerability. We can spend years building the perfect walls to protect ourselves, only to tear them all down with one careless glance. Stick with me, because this is where the air turns to ice. Dante's face was a terrifying canvas. Ara could not tell if he was amused or deciding how to dispose of her. Those 3 seconds of eye contact felt like an eternity. She ran back to the kitchen, her chest heaving to catch her breath. Marcus saw her shaking, but she pushed past him to grab the next bottle of wine. She stepped back into that suffocating room. The woman in red blew a thick cloud of smoke into her path. As Ara reached for a glass, one of the men threw his arm back, hitting her wrist hard. Time slowed as the bottle slipped from her fingers. The lesson is tragically cruel. Pure panic always makes our hands fail when we need their strength the most. The heavy glass exploded, sending dark red wine splattering across the white linen like a fresh wound. The entire room went dead silent. Ara stopped breathing, her body frozen over the jagged shards. A ragged apology barely made it past her trembling lips. Then Dante finally spoke. He gently said it was fine. His voice was completely flat and terrifyingly calm. He dabbed at the stain, watching her squirm. When she tried to beg for forgiveness, his piercing look snapped her mouth shut instantly. He then turned to his own man, Carlo, and ordered him to apologize to the waitress. Carlo turned the color of pale ash. There is a dark truth hidden here. The cruelest men do not just punish mistakes, they weaponize them to put invisible chains on everyone else in the room. Dante quietly told her to bring another bottle. Ara could barely feel her legs as she moved. Her fingers trembled so violently she nearly cut herself on the broken glass. Marcus rushed in to sweep up the mess, while the men went right back to discussing their violent trades. When Ara returned, she gripped the new bottle like a lifeline. She could feel their dark eyes peeling away her defenses. Yet, she pushed the panic down and finished pouring the wine. When she asked to leave, Dante gave her a polite smile that felt exactly like a loaded threat. She collapsed against the cold kitchen tiles, gasped for air. It is a harsh reality of human nature. Sometimes a polite thank you from a true monster is far more damaging than a screaming threat from a total stranger. A coworker pushed a glass of water into her hands, whispering that she was lucky to walk out alive. But a dangerous seed was already planted in Ara's mind. Why did a man so ruthless show her such quiet mercy? This is exactly how the psychological tragedy begins. We desperately try to find warmth in the cold hands of our abusers. Marcus met her by the back door, his voice thick with fear. He warned her that men like Dante never forget a face they find interesting. The terrible realization hit her. She was now on the radar of an apex predator. She promised to be careful and walked out into the freezing night air. Her car was 3 dark blocks away. It goes to show a painful lesson. We often step out of one nightmare, only to realize we are walking completely blind into another. She parked in the dark because she could not afford the lighted garage. Then she heard it, the slow, rhythmic crunch of footsteps behind her. Anyone who has ever felt hunted knows the oldest rule of survival. If you run, the wolf will chase you down. Ara forced herself to keep a steady walking pace, her heart pounding against her ribs. A voice echoed in the cold air. She spun around. It was one of Dante's men. He stood just out of reach, completely relaxed. He politely said Dante wanted to make sure she got to her car safely. The psychological cruelty was brilliant. He used the terror of the dark alley to make her feel indebted to a crime boss. The lesson is brutally clear. The deadliest traps in life are always painted to look exactly like a heroic rescue. Let us look at this closely together, because the real emotional damage happens long after the screaming stops. They walked the rest of the way in total silence. Ara wanted to scream, to ask what he really wanted, but fear kept her mouth shut. She shoved her key into the rusty door of her car. The man leaned against the hood, quietly watching her hands shake. He softly told her she was safe, whispering that next time she should not grip the wine bottle so tightly. Ara could only nod in horror. Once inside, she locked the doors and watched him fade back into the shadows. The drive home was an empty blur. There is a tragic irony in human survival. Our fear teaches us to shrink down and hide in the shadows, but sometimes those shadows are exactly where the darkest monsters actually live. Once locked inside her apartment, her legs finally gave out. She brewed tea but just stared at the rising steam. Her instincts screamed to pack a bag, quit her job, and disappear. But the suffocating weight of her debts kept her trapped in that room. Life does not care if you are terrified, the bills still come due. She convinced herself she just needed to work harder at being invisible. The next night, she took a double shift, hoping the noise would drown out her fear. But by Thursday night, the nightmare walked right back through the front doors. It is a bitter truth that breaks so many hearts. You can pack up and run as fast as you want, but you can never truly hide from someone who has already mapped out your deepest weaknesses. Dante walked into the crowded restaurant alone, wearing a casual suit and a charming smile. Ara froze in her tracks. The breath left her lungs as the hostess led him straight to her section. This was no mistake. Predators love to pull their victims away from the safety of the herd. Her mind screamed to run out the back door, but her feet were glued to the floor. He looked up with an amused smirk and politely asked if she was just going to stand there. Her training kicked in, and she quietly asked what he wanted to drink. He ordered a scotch, telling her to surprise him. She hurried to find the most expensive bottle they had. It highlights a fatal human flaw we all share. When cornered by a terrifying threat, we foolishly try to prove how useful we can be just to survive. Notice the slight tremor in Ara's hands. She holds her drink like a fragile shield. Returning to the amber-lit booth, she finds Vali bathed in the cold glow of his phone. She sets the glass down, hyper-aware of her own ragged breathing. He praises the drink, his voice dripping with suffocating patience. Then comes the pivot. "Sit down," he softly commands. Every instinct screams at her to run, yet she perches on the leather seat like a trapped bird. "Relax," he soothes, as she whispers she is on the clock. "You are working. I am asking you to sit." He is already reshaping her reality. We often search for terrifying monsters in the dark, but life teaches us a simple truth. True manipulation almost always wears the quiet, disarming mask of humility. The apology hits her like a physical blow. The camera lingers on her face, capturing the raw cognitive shock of a predator showing mercy. She searches his eyes, noting the faint scars and a weary humanity he projects perfectly. He casually shifts blame for the shattered bottle onto his associate. "You handled it well," he praises, rewarding her emotional suppression. He sees the tension in her shoulders. When she admits her fear, he nods. "Smart, but you do not have to be, not unless you give me a reason." It is a flawless psychological trap, an illusion of safety built on total surrender. This emotional whiplash leaves her gasping for air. The painful truth we eventually learn is that someone who shatters your reality often does so just to become the only solid ground left to stand on. Hearing her name slip from his lips paralyzes her. The clatter of the dining room fades into silence. He leans in, telling her to request the private room tomorrow for a lucrative party. When she questions him, the dim light catches his disarming smile. "Because you need the money," he reasons, framing his calculated control as a rare act of grace. She wants to reject his shadow, but poverty forces her head to bow. For the rest of the evening, Vali becomes a ghost. He eats quietly and leaves a rendered tip. This performance of absolute normalcy is a deadly weapon. By acting flawlessly, he erodes her fear, leaving a toxic attitude in its place. Life teaches us a hard lesson here. Gifts from those who seek control are never free. They are simply early down payments on your absolute compliance. You and I know that the mere absence of a threat is not true safety. For Ara, the following weeks feel like standing in the dead center of a hurricane. She works the event, earning triple her income. Crucially, she walks to her car at midnight alone. Then, Vali vanishes for 2 full weeks. This withdrawal is a brutal emotional starvation tactic. It forces the target to unconsciously crave the predator's presence. Spring arrives, and Ara buries herself in a numb routine. She banks the cash, violently suppressing the memory of his dark eyes. But the tragic seed is already sown. A hard truth of the human heart is that quiet peace can sometimes feel like an empty void. By removing himself, he ensures her safe life will feel hollow compared to the intoxicating focus he once granted her. Her isolated existence is the perfect tragic stage for a man like him. In April, Vali returns. Same shadowy table, same inescapable demand. When he softly orders her to sit, weaponizing her name, her exhausted body complies. He asks about her life with calculated intimacy, then casually mentions her private shifts. She freezes, asking how he knows. "I own 20% of this restaurant," he states. It is a crushing display of omnipotence. Her only safe haven was actually his hunting ground. He leans in, probing why she needs the cash. She tries to deflect, warning that curiosity is dangerous. His chilling smile catches the low light. "Only if you are not careful," he replies. "We must learn to be wary of those who hold power. A true manipulator never asks a question without already holding the exact answer." The warm dining room hums, in contrasting the cold psychological cage locking around her. "I am paying off student loans," she confesses. We often surrender our truths to someone who seems all-knowing. He probes deeper, unearthing her buried passion for art history. "But you wanted to," he observes, tracking every flicker of regret. He is not making conversation. He is mapping her unmet desires. When she admits her abandoned dreams, he delivers a soft, chilling promise. "It might matter," he says. A customer signals, breaking the heavy spell so she can bolt. She retreats, heart hammering, terrified by the sensation of standing on an emotional precipice. Here is the tragic flaw in human longing. Dark figures will always identify your starved aspirations, quietly making themselves the only key to your deepest dreams. Picture the scene with me. The diner is suffocatingly quiet, the neon sign humming a low rhythm against the damp glass. When Ara steps back to her station, the solitary man is gone, leaving behind 5 crisp $100 bills. Her breath catches. The camera lingers on her trembling fingers. Her colleague Marcus leans in close, urging her to keep the cash for rent and simple survival. She slips the money into her apron, unknowingly swallowing the hook. He returns week after week, claiming that exact corner booth. He speaks softly of art, patiently mapping the fragile contours of her mind. The lesson here is deeply tragic. Sometimes our sheer desperation to survive makes us utterly blind to the invisible, deadly traps we willingly walk right into. The lighting shifts to the harsh glare of a May afternoon in a crowded cafe. Watch the subtle, devastating change in Ara. She no longer feels violated by his gaze. Instead, she feels seen. Her friend Jenna leans across the small table, coffee growing cold, desperately trying to intervene. Jenna knows the dark whispers. She warns Ara that this man's cat carries a brutal history, a shadow painted in blood. Yet Ara's jaw tightens. She defends him, clinging to the illusion that he is just a lonely patron asking about her dreams. But beneath the table, her hands ache from gripping her own knees. She is terrified, realizing Dante Varelli is a predator bleeding into her quiet world. It reminds us of a bitter life lesson. We often fiercely defend the very illusions destined to destroy us. The camera pushes in close as Ara finally shatters the physical boundary. Listen to the harsh scrape of the wooden chair as she sits at his table, uninvited. She stares him down, demanding to know why he haunts her section every single Tuesday night. Dante does not flinch. Instead, he offers a low, disarming laugh that fills the quiet room. It is a masterful performance of warmth. He tells her she is the only soul alive who looks at him without calculating his threat. By declaring she is no longer afraid, she seals her own fate. The raw terror inside her has tragically mutated into a fatal curiosity. It is a haunting lesson for us all. The absolute most dangerous illusion a person can hold is the quiet belief that they are the sole exception to a monster's rule. Stick with me here, because this is the exact moment the trap snaps shut. Ara asks, voice barely above a whisper, if she should be afraid. Dante nods slowly. He offers us the most dangerous weapon of all, a partial truth. He confesses that honesty is a luxury he can rarely afford, projecting the profound, aching loneliness of a fallen king. He frames the bloody burden of being Dante Varelli as a sweeping tragedy, rather than the consequence of his own brutal choices. When she asks what he truly wants, the heavy silence between them becomes an unspoken pact. A devastating threshold is crossed. This teaches us something vital about human nature. Pity is the lock, and shared loneliness is the key that opens the door to our own ruin. She would regret this night forever. The seasons bleed into a sweltering summer, and the psychological conditioning takes deep root. Dante vanishes for days, only to reappear, like a ghost, a calculated starvation, and designed to make her crave his presence. When he sits in her section, the tips remain generous but routine, dismantling her defenses. They trade quiet secrets in the dim light. He speaks of a sister in Boston, painting himself as an ordinary man, masking the violence of his true nature. Ara unconsciously memorizes his rhythms, pouring scotch when his shoulders are tight, wine when the storm has passed. But the true horror lies outside. Dark sedans idle in the heat haze beneath her window. The lesson is chilling. We adjust to the creeping darkness so slowly that we forget what the light looked like. The tension finally snaps in late June. You and I are going to watch this climax closely. When Ara confronts him about the shadowy men watching her apartment, Dante does not flinch or lie. He simply admits she has become too important to leave unguarded. The camera frames her trembling hands pressed flat against the cool tabletop. Her nervous system is in full revolt. She begs to be released, pleading that she does not know the brutal rules of his underworld. But Dante slowly leans in, closing the physical gap until the air between them burns. He demands she speak the name of the forbidden bond tying them together. The tragedy is complete. True captivity begins the exact moment we agree to put a name to the invisible chains that hold us down. Come with me. Let us step into the shadows together and watch this tragedy unfold. In the flickering light of the restaurant back office, Elara stands alone. Suddenly, the muffled thud of violence bleeds through the drywall. Peering through a cracked door, she sees Tommy backed against the cold tile, two men gripping heavy steel pipes. His eyes are hollow with terror. Survival demands absolute stillness, yet human nature is rarely logical. We often rush toward the fire to save another, forgetting that we too might burn. Driven by panic, she bolts toward the security alarm, but a floorboard groans loudly beneath her feet. The intruders snap their gaze toward the sound. Eye contact is made. The predator has finally found his prey. The blare of the alarm tears through the silence like jagged glass. A heavy hand violently shoves Elara against the wall, and the room spins into a blur of raw chaos. Her mind shatters into fragmented flashes, the sickening crack of bone, the metallic scent of blood. As the attackers are dragged away, she stumbles backward into a firm chest. Dante, the grand architect of this nightmare, steps into the light, perfectly playing the role of her savior. His hands grip her trembling shoulders, forcing her eyes to meet his cold stare. The lesson here is deeply tragic. In moments of pure panic, a desperate heart will easily mistake a well-built cage for a sanctuary. She leans into the monster who set the trap, falsely believing the worst is over. Red strobes of police cruisers paint the restaurant walls, yet the room is thick with quiet corruption. Officers whisper in the shadows, stepping back as Dante dictates the narrative. Wrapped in a blanket, Alara watches him. His voice remains smooth, a chilling display of sociopathic grace as he charms the lead detective. You cannot plant a seed in poisoned soil, just as you can never find true peace in the arms of a violent man. Yet, her traumatized mind clings to him. Marcus slumps into Tess's chair beside her, his face aged 10 years in a single night. Through heavy breaths, he confesses the brutal truth. The men on the floor were simply sending a message in blood, trying to intimidate the true king of this unforgiving territory. The ground beneath Alara crumbles as Marcus reveals the depth of their reality. Dante owns everything. Every shadow in this place belongs to his syndicate. Shivering violently, she lets someone drive her home, staring blindly at the passing streetlights. Inside her tiny apartment, the silence is deafening. She turns on the television, but the empty chatter offers no comfort. True loneliness is rarely the absence of people. It is the terrifying realization that you are entirely unprotected in a dangerous world. Then her phone lights up, a single message from Dante. He casually notes that her door should be locked, mentioning his men are parked downstairs. The unseen net pulls tight. With a few words, he erases the outside world, making himself the sole architect of her survival. Watch his shadow move. You and I can see the trap being laid. Dante speaks on the phone like a velvet hammer, using guilt to carefully strip away her independence. When the call drops, Alara creeps to the glass. Down in the empty street sits a black sedan, a protector or a warden. Sometimes, the hands that shield us from the storm are the exact same ones that build our cage. She spends the night awake, paralyzed by the memory of violence. By dawn, she is completely hollow. At 9, her phone rings. Dante speaks softly, forging a false intimacy out of their shared sleeplessness. He dictates her extraction, casually mentioning he has cancelled her work shifts. It is an absolute theft of her autonomy. She should feel fierce rage, yet the anger never arrives. The poison of the trauma bond has already taken root. Instead of feeling outrage at the theft of her freedom, her exhausted body slumps in quiet relief. She asks where he is taking her, a weak attempt to hold on to her crumbling boundaries. But her apartment no longer feels safe. The saddest truth of the human mind is how quickly it will embrace captivity if the outside world feels too dangerous. At noon, an operative named Vincent arrives. No words are exchanged. She climbs into a blacked-out vehicle, watching the familiar city fade behind tinted glass. They arrive at a towering fortress of steel, a monument to extreme wealth and absolute power. Vincent swipes a silent keycard. The elevator ride is suffocatingly quiet, pulling her irreversibly into the predator's domain. The doors open into a cold, sterile expanse. This is not a home. It is a monument to a dark ego, built to make a person feel completely powerless. The massive windows command a godlike view of the city. Dante stands silhouetted against the glass. He turns, smoothly claiming she's free to leave. A beautiful lie after systematically destroying her alternatives. He offers a heavy pour of liquor, but she refuses. A vital lesson emerges here. Never accept the poison meant to blind you to the trap. Dante then calmly explains the bloodshed. He names the rival faction, brushing off the brutal assault on his employees as minor business friction. He takes a slow sip of his drink. His hand does not shake. He absorbs human terror with absolute apathy, completely unaffected by the chaos. Dante stares into her eyes, coldly calling her a liability. He takes her deepest fear, that her mere presence will bring death to others, and twists it like a knife. The cruelest way to imprison someone is to convince them they are the actual danger. He mocks the police, making it clear the laws of the outside world no longer exist here. Yet, when he casually orders her to stay locked in his glass tower, something inside Alara snaps. The fog of shock burns away into primal rage. She steps forward, trembling with defiance, demanding the truth. If she is a pawn on his blood-soaked chessboard, she refuses to play blindfolded. A heavy silence stretches across the room. Dante's dark eyes narrow. The predator is silently calculating whether this prey must be manipulated further or broken. Let us look at this scene together. Notice how the penthouse perfectly mirrors Dante's soul. Vast, frozen, and utterly empty. He speaks of the looming war, not as a moral failing, but as a dark law of nature. He plans an understanding, a brutally polite word for murder. His voice drops to a whisper, exposing the true monster beneath the suit. Then comes the ultimate deception. He promises that if she stays quiet, she can return to her old life once the bodies are buried. A profound truth lives here. A dark soul will burn your world to ashes and casually expect you to sweep them up. A dry, humorless laugh escapes Ilara's throat. It is the agonizing sound of a spirit breaking. She stares out at the sweeping glass walls, the cold reality settling deep. The cage is tightly locked. Ilara's voice shakes as she demands the terrifying truth. She asks why a king of the underworld would obsess over an insignificant waitress. In 3 quick strides, Dante closes the space between them, a stunning display of restrained, predatory dominance. Leaning in close, he whispers that she makes him feel human. It is a devastating manipulation. He takes the black void of his damaged soul and begs her to fill it. This reveals a deeply tragic lesson. A gentle heart will often bleed itself dry, trying to heal a broken monster. Just as a captive slowly falls for their warden, Ilara begins to absorb his emotional needs as her own sacred duty. By painting himself as the vulnerable victim, he brilliantly guarantees she will feel morally bound to save him from the deadly abyss. The weight of his manipulation hits her like a physical blow. Her breathing hitches. Staring into his eyes, she asks him to stay, begging for 2 days to process the reality wrapping around her throat. Then, the ultimate terror settles deep within her. She no longer wants to return to her safe, quiet life. The poison has taken hold, and the trauma bond is set like concrete. Abandoning all self-preservation, she demands his darkest secrets. Let us analyze this final tragedy together. Dante steps into the light, confessing his role in moving illicit cargo for Kingpin Vittorio. He is a perfect mirror of his master's narcissism, yet she does not run. The most painful lesson of humanity is that sometimes we willingly embrace the fire that destroys us. She is prepared to be swallowed whole. Step into the frame with me, and let us examine the anatomy of a beautiful, terrifying ruin. The harsh light catches the sharp angles of Dante's face as he lists his sins. He paints his silence as a heavy iron shield meant only to protect her, a masterful stroke of manipulation. When Ara finally asks if he has taken a life, His answer comes without a single flicker of hesitation. Yes, his cold admission hangs in the quiet air, a ghost that should send her running. Yet, watch the way her shoulders soften. Her survival instinct screams, but her fragile soul is already rewriting this real monster into a misunderstood savior. We often find that the lies we tell ourselves just to feel safe can be far more dangerous than the brutal truth we are trying to escape. Any rational mind would shatter right here, sprinting for the door to escape an admitted killer. But the camera lingers on Ara, lost in a tragic fog, her voice barely above a whisper. She asks to see the rest of his gilded cage. Dante leads her through a sweeping labyrinth of echoing bedrooms and pristine bathrooms. It is a sterile, breathtaking set design of wealth, entirely devoid of a soul. When she murmurs about the chilling perfection of the space, the kingpin lets his armor slip. He confesses that this mansion is merely a theater, a hollow stage built to project untouchable dominance to his rivals. He sacrificed every ounce of human warmth for the bleeding illusion of godhood. It reminds us that building a massive fortress to keep your enemies out usually just leaves you trapped inside, completely and utterly alone. We see her desperately trying to mirror him, comparing his violent deceptions to the tired, painted-on smile she wears to survive her own shifts at work. It is a heartbreaking reach for true connection. While Dante orders their food, the lens tracks Ara wandering through the cavernous guest suite. Her small belongings look painfully out of place against all the silk and mahogany. Returning to the dim glow of the living room, she watches him move like a general mapping out a war. He casually drops the name Castellano, outlining a looming 2 o'clock clash for the following afternoon. He promises the crowded venue will prevent a slaughter, but his shadowed eyes carry the absolute promise of bloodshed. Trying to find common ground with a destructive force does not tame it. It only drags you right into the dead center of the storm. When she asks how he carries the crushing weight of his empire, his answer is steeped in a breathtaking, arrogant sorrow. He frames himself as a cursed titan, the only man capable of holding the absolute darkness at bay in his mind. His brutality is a beautiful sacrifice. 40 minutes later, a lavish feast of Thai food arrives. The camera pulls back, framing them against the glittering expanse of the Chicago skyline. It feels almost normal, which is a fatal illusion. Dante shifts the focus to art, and Ara's face lights up. She speaks passionately of Rothko's bleeding colors and the heavy despair of the Renaissance. With every trembling word, she hands this predator the keys to her fragile soul. Sharing our deepest passions can create true bonds, but giving them to the wrong person simply hands them a map to our weakest points. The lighting shifts, softening Dante's face as he leans in, playing the rapt audience. He mirrors her passion perfectly, setting the hook deep into her heart. Then comes the tragic turn. He speaks of a piano he once played, a gift that died 15 years ago when his father's blood stained the family crown, forcing him onto this dark throne. It is a flawless performance of shared sorrow. Ara's remaining defenses crumble. She looks at this killer and sees only a broken artist, much like her own shattered dreams. As they stand side by side washing the dishes, the gentle sound of running water masks the terrifying reality. It is a haunting domestic picture, painted over a ticking time bomb. Empathy is a wonderful trait, but we must never let our desire to heal someone blind us to the undeniable danger they bring into our lives. Let us look closely at the frame of this scene together. Ara wanders alone through the apartment, dwarfed by the cold, expensive art. Yet she drifts toward a tiny, unassuming painting of a misty forest. When Dante steps from the shadows to whisper that his mother painted it before she died, the trap springs shut. He offers her this perfectly lit morsel of childhood grief, and she takes it. Her eyes well up as she shares the memory of her own father's sudden death when she was only 12. The camera tightens on their faces, capturing the birth of a doomed trauma bond. Dante's face remains a beautiful mask of sympathy, but make no mistake, he does not feel her tragic pain. He is using it to permanently chain her to his dark world. True vulnerability should be a sacred exchange, not a heavy weapon used to control a desperately lonely heart. The physical toll of this dark romance is devastating to witness. Ara's voice trembles as she recounts the day her father's heart stopped, an unpredictable nightmare that left her desperate for a safe harbor. Now, her body is drained, shaking like a leaf in the wind. Dante steps into the frame, a towering pillar of calm, commanding her to rest while he shoulders the weight of the coming war. It is a sickening paradox. She yearns to stay awake beside the very demon who ruined her life, confusing his iron grip for a warm embrace. She slips into the guest bed, the cool silk soothing her feverish skin. Through the walls, the rhythmic hum of Dante speaking Italian acts as a dark lullaby, pulling her into a deep slumber. It is a harsh reminder that seeking comfort in the arms of chaos will only put you to sleep right before the real nightmare begins. 13 agonizing hours pass in silence. When her eyes finally flutter open, the light in the room is soft. Dante is already there, a dark phantom holding a perfectly crafted cup of coffee, right down to the exact splash of cream. It is a terrifying intimacy. When Ara whispers that she feels like a ghost drifting through someone else's life, she is unraveling before our eyes. Dante checks his watch, announcing his departure for the 2 o'clock meeting, leaving his massive shadow, Marco, to guard the door. Watch the panic flood Ara's face. The tragedy is complete. She no longer fears the monster keeping her locked in this ivory tower. Her heart shatters at the mere thought that her captor might not come back. We often grow dangerously attached to our own cages, terrified of the vast emptiness that might follow if the architect of our pain simply walked away. Dante uses the warm, domestic smell of breakfast to paint over the madness of her captivity. When he emerges draped in a sharp charcoal suit, it is the armor of a warlord marching to his doom. He pulls her into his chest, whispering his thanks for her trust. You and I know the devastating truth here. She never had a choice. He systematically burned every bridge behind her until he was the only island left. By calling her surrender a willing embrace, he turns the final lock on her psychological cage. As the heavy door clicks shut behind him, Ara is left standing alone in the vast silence. She does not look for a way out. She simply stands there, paralyzed by the fear that the man who stole her life might bleed for her. When we allow someone to completely isolate us from the world, we will eventually start to mistake our total dependence on them for a profound love. The ticking clock becomes the loudest sound in the world. Ara paces the silent cage, a beautiful bird trapped far above the indifferent pulse of the city. At 2 o'clock, Marco steps into the frame. He sits quietly with a book, playing the gentle guardian, but his massive frame blocks the only exit. The tension in the room is suffocating. Ara tries to sketch, but her hands tremble violently, her body breaking under the invisible weight of her dread. Then, exactly at 5, the heavy silence shatters. The phone rings. Dante's sharp voice echoes through the speaker, commanding her to pack a bag immediately. The master director knows exactly how to keep her heart racing so fast that she can never stop to breathe. If you never give a person the space to stop and think, they will never realize the hand leading them forward is the same one keeping them completely hostage. This is the exact frame where her old life burns to the ground. Over the crackling phone line, Dante reveals that his rival has found her tiny, quiet apartment. Whether it is true or just another brilliant manipulation, the curtain falls all the same. Her safe haven is gone forever. Dante smoothly offers to swallow her whole, proposing to move her into his world permanently and pay her the wages she will lose. It is a breathtakingly cruel transaction, wrapping a heavy golden chain around her neck. We watch the tears finally spill over Ara's lashes. She does not want his blood money. She aches for the lonely piece of the life she had just days ago. But that world is ashes now, leaving her clinging to the very man who struck the match. We rarely appreciate the quiet safety of an ordinary routine until we find ourselves standing in a burning room, begging to go back. Stay with me for this final, agonizing sequence. Ara begs for a single breath of air, pleading for a moment to think. Dante grants her 1 hour, but the camera lingers on the tragic irony. She has nowhere to go. Into this void steps Marco, playing his part in the grand design by pressing a cold vodka tonic into her shaking hand. The liquor blurs the sharp edges of her terror, sinking her deeper into the velvet trap. Watch closely as Ara begins to question the enforcer about his 10 years with the crime family. Her tear-streaked face searches Marco's eyes, begging for a sign that her captor is secretly a savior. It is the ultimate tragedy of the human spirit, painting a bright halo over a devil just to survive the night. When we are drowning in absolute fear, we will often convince ourselves that the heavy anchor dragging us under is actually a sturdy lifeboat. Marco offers the exact psychological poison she starves for, disguised as validation. He swears that Dante, a man carved from pure ruthlessness, is entirely different when he looks at her. It is the tragic illusion of exceptionalism. The captive mind desperately convinces itself it has miraculously cured the predator. Drunk on this hollow power, Ara lays out fragile conditions for surrender. She asks to step outside for small tasks and for total honesty about the violence knocking at their door. It is a heartbreaking negotiation for basic dignity dressed up as a business deal. The life lesson here is as quiet as it is devastating. Listen, sometimes we fiercely believe we are drawing our boundaries. We are merely tracing the exact dimensions of our own permanent prison. You and I have to look closely at how this final lock clicks into place. Dante lets a heavy, suffocating pause hang in the air, performing a calculated reluctance before agreeing to her terms. He offers a disarming smile, a weapon deployed to cement her trust, before dropping the most dangerous word imaginable: home. They glide through the city to his Lincoln Park fortress. Its warm brownstone aesthetic perfectly hides a maximum security enclosure. Heavy iron gates groan shut behind them. They descend into a hidden garage, leaving 0 witnesses. Ara steps over the threshold into total isolation, entirely by her own choice. It is a harsh truth we all eventually learn. Safety provided by a violent predator is never a real sanctuary. It is only ever a slightly more comfortable cage. The scene immediately reveals a jarring contrast to Dante's sterile displays of power. This hidden apartment is warmly lit and haphazardly cluttered. Discarded jackets, old books, and unwashed coffee mugs are scattered everywhere. It is a psychological anomaly for a man so violently obsessed with control. He guides Ara inside, his broad shoulders stiff with an awkwardness you would never expect from a feared crime boss. Ara lets her gaze drift to the framed photographs on the wall. Faded images of a mother and a young sister sit like fragile artifacts of a fractured past. Dante hovers in the doorway, caught in a sudden moment of vulnerability. The lesson is unavoidable. No matter how deeply into the dark a person wanders, even the hardest minds leave quiet fragments of their lost humanity hiding in plain sight. Dante nervously offers her food, his commanding presence faltering. When she softly declines his attempts to manage her comfort, he admits he is entirely unused to sharing his space. For 5 long years, he lived in a self-imposed exile, building mental walls so high that not even his closest soldiers could enter. This isolation is the desperate defense of a predator terrified of betrayal. Ara cuts through the tension with a gentle promise to spare his books from judgment, and a faint light flickers in his dark eyes. She slowly unpacks her meager belongings, just a sketchpad and 2 days of clothes. The lesson is undeniable. Profound isolation breeds its own madness, but a single thread of authentic human connection can quickly collapse years of cold iron walls. Her few possessions look tragic scattered across his heavy furniture. They are the physical evidence of a life uprooted by trauma. She finds him in the kitchen, stripped of his tailored suits and wearing plain denim. The power dynamic subtly shifts in the shadows. They sit with red wine in an uneasy, loaded silence. When Ara mentions his rival, Castellano, Dante's voice drops to a chilling pitch. He admits to weaponizing the rival's daughter, tracking her school to force a ceasefire. Ara feels physically sick at the ruthless implication, even as Dante flatly denies ever intending to harm the girl. His psychological warfare was flawless. Life teaches us a grim lesson here. Those who hold absolute power are often the ones most willing to exploit the innocent vulnerabilities of others. You and I must carefully examine Ara's reaction as the scene darkens. Dante explains that his enemies now view her as a vulnerability. His solution is classic megalomaniac behavior. He establishes dominance by threatening unspeakable violence against anyone who touches her. He speaks of murder as casually as discussing the weather. Logically, Ara should be repulsed. Instead, she feels a profound, disturbing wave of relief wash over her frame. This is the tragic seed of Stockholm Syndrome taking root. Her mind twists sheer fear into gratitude, finding dark comfort in the monster who promises to keep the other monsters at bay. It is a devastating truth of human nature. We sometimes desperately seek our safety in the exact fires that originally burned our lives to the ground. Dante confesses that without violence, he has no identity. It is a classic symptom of a fractured ego, entirely dependent on external dominance to survive. Ara wants to offer an escape, but her crushed aspirations keep her silent. Instead, she asks for a secret disconnected from his criminal empire. Dante offers a calculated piece of vulnerability. He admits to a lifelong phobia of dogs. Stemming from a childhood incident with a German shepherd, the feared mob boss secretly terrified of golden retrievers. Ara bursts into helpless laughter at the sheer absurdity. It is a dark masterclass in psychological manipulation. The lesson is chillingly clear. True predators know exactly which harmless weaknesses to casually reveal, just to make their prey feel perfectly safe resting inside their jaws. When the focus shifts, Ara reveals her abandoned ambition to run an art museum. Her voice is briefly animated by the ghost of a former passion. But she quickly shatters her own dream, citing her father's debts and a deep fear of inadequacy. The self-deprecation is typical of victims who shrink themselves down to survive. Dante refuses to accept her broken narrative. He validates her talent, pointing out how her face illuminates when she discusses art. He challenges her core belief that she is not good enough. Overwhelmed by the terrifying sensation of being truly seen, Ara rapidly deflects the conversation back to his sister. The lesson is profound. Recognizing someone's buried potential is often the fastest, reduced way to completely bypass their heaviest emotional defenses. Dante speaks of his sister, Sophia, with a quiet, melancholic reverence. She offered him a legitimate escape after their father died, but he chose the underworld instead. He clinically diagnoses his own youthful arrogance, the delusion that he could rule a violent criminal empire while keeping his conscience pure. He states a fundamental law of his reality. One cannot exist halfway in the dark. It is total consumption or death. The silence that follows is thick with the suffocating weight of irreversible decisions. To break the tension, he shifts back to the mundane task of cooking dinner, drawing Ara into the small kitchen alongside him. This proves a deadly truth. The most dangerous traps we ever fall into are the ones we confidently believe we can walk away from at any time. Stick with me here, because this is where the psychological dynamic fractures. As garlic sizzles, Dante bitterly dismantles Ara's attempts to romanticize him. He states his reality with brutal precision. He kills people. He runs a crime syndicate. He is the monster his mother feared. But Ara, entrenched in Stockholm Syndrome, insists on viewing him through extreme rationalization. She highlights his protective traits to justify her attachment. The cognitive dissonance is deafening. Unable to process her blind acceptance, Dante crosses the room and kisses her violently. It is a desperate play of guilt and overwhelming possession. We frequently project pure goodness onto deeply broken people, simply because facing their true darkness is far too terrifying for our fragile minds. Let's look at this piece by piece. We see the classic push and pull dynamic immediately taking hold. He offers a weak apology for the sudden kiss, a calculated display of false vulnerability. She responds by stepping forward and pulling him back into an embrace. This exact moment is the dark inception of the trauma bond. You and I can clearly see how Stockholm Syndrome takes root in a willing subject. She whispers that she no longer cares about the physical danger of his violent world. The bitter lesson here is simple, yet deeply tragic. When a person is starved for basic human visibility, they will gladly step right into the crosshairs just to finally feel seen. Her fragile ego makes her the perfect supply for his megalomaniac tendencies. The camera pushes in to observe her cognitive distortion happening in real time. Ara frames his face with trembling hands, verbally erasing his violent criminal identity. She claims she sees only the man, completely ignoring the monster. This is a desperate defense mechanism for the captive psyche, the absolute idealization of the captor. He kisses her again, sealing the moment as both a promise and a dark threat, cementing his dominance. They quietly finish preparing the meal. The warm domesticity acts as a bizarre counterweight to her psychological imprisonment. The underlying truth of human behavior is that we will quickly normalize the abnormal just to survive. Every accidental touch at that small dinner table is merely another neurological tether binding her to a dangerous sociopath. The camera drifts from the oak doors where Dante commands his bleeding empire in clipped Italian, settling into the dim living room. Here sits Ara, curled into a velvet sofa, absorbing the ambient terror like a moth circling a dying bulb. When the heavy doors click open, the silence is deafening. Dante leans against the frame, shadowed, rubbing his temples in a perfect display of engineered exhaustion. He gestures toward her worn novel, whispering he only wants to survive another night. The lighting softens, framing him not as a monster, but as a martyr. You and I are going to unpack this performance together. The bitter truth we must all learn is that the darkest predators never cast themselves as the villain. They only ever play the weary survivor. The last walls of her sanity slowly crumble under the sheer weight of exhaustion. He lifts her easily, carrying her to the massive bed. It is a beautiful, terrifying choreography of complete dominance, cleverly dressed up as a lover's tender rescue. Her trembling fingers grip his dark lapels as she desperately begs him not to leave her alone. He offers a hollow warning about the poison in his blood, knowing full well it will only pull her deeper into the tide. She whispers that he just needs someone to believe in him. It breaks the heart to witness this illusion take hold. Trying to mend a deeply shattered soul will only ever leave you bleeding from their broken edges. He brushes his lips against her forehead, sealing the curse, and watches her slip into a defenseless sleep. Deep dawn bleeds pale gray light through the high-arched windows. She is entirely alone now, save for the silent shadow of Marco standing guard beyond the front door. Her soft footsteps map the edges of her gilded cage until she stops before a grand piano buried under dust. Hesitantly, she presses a single key, letting a fragile melody echo in the vast room. Suddenly, the air drops 10 degrees. Dante fills the doorway, his posture rigid, plunging her back into absolute submission. She stammers an apology just for breathing his air. He coldly states he no longer plays. The tragedy of a violent life is that a man must bury every soft and beautiful thing inside himself just to survive, dragging that heavy, hollow chest through the world forever. Yet she does not shrink away from the chill in his eyes. She pushes him to sit, to touch the keys. For a man who writes his life in blood, this is a masterclass in calculated vulnerability. His scarred hands hover over the ivory, muscle memory dragging out a haunting piece by Chopin. It is unpolished, yet dripping with a raw, agonizing sorrow that paints his brutal nature in tragic, romantic hues. She whispers how beautiful the music is. A bitter smile touches the corner of his mouth as he mutters that even monsters are allowed to have hobbies, completely stripping away her final defense. We have to remember that a beautiful melody does not erase a history of cruelty. So often, charm and art are just the velvet gloves that violence wears to hold our hands. In the quiet dimness of the room, she weaves her own fatal illusion, telling him that even the darkest souls deserve a glimpse of light. She crowns herself as his singular savior. He anchors this tragedy with a slow kiss, murmuring against her lips that he will utterly destroy her. To her fevered mind, it is a promise of passion, not a threat. Let us look closely at how this trap operates. They let the afternoon drift by in a quiet domestic pantomime. But as shadows lengthen, the predator springs the trap. He casually mentions that the syndicate will know she belongs to him by tonight. This is no grand romance. It is the branding of a prized possession. The quiet lesson here is that when a monster builds a wall to protect you, they are also building your permanent prison. The camera lingers on her face as the irreversible weight of his words finally settles in. He tells her, with eyes as cold as black ice, that the underworld will now see her as his sole property. Where a sane mind would shatter in terror, a tragic, breathless glow illuminates her features. She feels chosen. He whispers that having her near makes him look human to the wolves, twisting his possessive grip into a confession of a terrified boy, afraid of losing his only light. She is no longer a woman with a future. She is merely an anchor tied to a drowning man. The greatest tragedy of trying to save a drowning soul is that you rarely pull them out of the water. Instead, You just become the heavy stone they drag down into the deep, dark abyss alongside them. The tragic opera enters its darkest act as he actively weaponizes his own history. She demands the raw truth, blindly convinced her heart is strong enough to hold his demons. The lighting cuts sharply across Dante's face as he exhales, slowly unfurling the nightmare of Maria, a former lover ripped from her home and held in a lightless box for 3 agonizing days. He paints the gruesome picture vividly, flipping the script from his own ruthless lifestyle to the tragedy of his bleeding heart. Ara is left feeling like the ultimate exception, driven deeper into his suffocating shadow for safety. If we listen closely, the truth is clear. A broken man will gladly lay out the bones of his past victims just to build a fence around the one he currently holds captive. He pulls away from her warmth, his jaw ticking as his voice drops into a deadened hum. He details how Maria survived the torment, but the sheer horror snapped her mind, forcing her to vanish into the wind. It is a blazing warning sign painted in blood. Stick with me, because this is where the psychology gets twisted. When Ara asks if he found the men responsible, his eyes go utterly vacant. He quietly describes erasing them from the earth, the men, their families, their homes turned to grey ash. Absolute ruin. Any sensible person would have sprinted for the door, yet she roots her feet to the floorboards. It is a heartbreaking flaw in our human design that we can look at a blazing fire of pure violence and somehow mistake it for the warmth of true love. This is the exact moment the steel trap snaps completely shut over her soul. A clear mind would have shattered a window to escape that room. Instead, watch how the camera follows her as she steps closer, burying her face into his chest, entirely erasing the line between her quiet life and his war zone. She convinces herself that standing beside the devil is safer than hiding behind his guards. When his arms finally crush around her, his massive frame shaking, she reads his adrenaline-soaked tremors as a desperate cry for affection. She promises they will burn in this fire together, offering up her identity on a silver platter. She locks her own cage from the inside. We lose ourselves the moment we tie our survival to the very storm that is tearing us apart. Notice how the simple, suffocating word hangs heavily in the air. He calls her his girl. It is a brand burned onto her skin, yet it sends a warm thrill of submission down her spine instead of cold panic. She whispers a vow to stay, sealing her fate in blood and breath. Later, wrapped in the shadows of the guest quarters, while he commands his empire through the walls, she stares at the ceiling. She maps out the absolute insanity of it all. Sleeping under the roof of a killer, waiting for a gangland war at dawn. But the sickness has already taken root deep in her chest. The most terrifying trick the human mind can play is taking a pitch-black descent into a living nightmare and wrapping it up in the soft, deceitful feeling of finally coming home. You and I must pause for a moment and look into her eyes in the quiet dark. Listening to the violent murmurs of his voice through the plaster, she feels a sick, twisted peace. But when dawn breaks, the brutal reality of daylight hits her like a physical blow. She is a hostage dressing for war. She pulls on dark, shapeless clothes, instinctively trying to shrink away from the coming violence. In the stark light of the kitchen, Dante waits. He is carved in a bespoke suit, looking every inch the flawless, untouchable king. He notes her trembling hands. His voice is a low rumble of absolute arrogance, promising they will bow to her simply because he demands it. The saddest truth of the human condition is that we often learn to adore the monster, just so the monster will not eat us. He promises that anyone who fails to show respect will simply cease to exist. He says this the way one might talk about the morning weather. He grips her waist, pulling her flush against his chest in a terrifying display of absolute ownership. He commands her never to lower her eyes again, decreeing that his shadow makes her immortal. The scene shifts to the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of a massive, derelict warehouse. Dozens of hardened, silent men circle a vast table. As Dante steps through the heavy iron doors, his fingers locked like a vice around her hand, the immense room goes completely dead. He is not holding her out of love. He is parading his newest prize. A king's power means absolutely nothing if he does not have a captive audience to watch him wield it. We need to look closely at Ara as she stands before this court of wolves. We are watching the final collapse of her old self. Her entire life, she survived by fading into the background. But here, bathed in harsh industrial light and surrounded by murderers, she lifts her chin. She mistakes this reckless defiance for bravery. In truth, she is just a drowning woman clinging to the very shark that circled her. Dante tightens his grip, his voice slicing through the silence as he promises death to any man who looks at her too long. When a soldier steps out of line, Dante crushes him with an icy stare. The tragic lesson we leave with is that genuine strength is born from walking alone. You can never find your own power by hiding behind who holds your leash. The camera lingers on the suffocating silence of the room. Dante's jaw locks as he claims Ara as his own, a possessive phrase that drops like an iron gate. Today, you and I are going to unpack this tragedy forming in the shadows. Elena leans into the dim light, questioning if Ara grasps the endless cycle of violence she is walking into. Ara's hands shake, yet, staring straight into her captor's cold eyes, she forces her voice to stay steady, declaring she chooses this cage. Elena smiles softly, misreading a frantic survival instinct as tragic courage. It is a devastating scene that reminds us of a hard reality. We often mistake our desperate need to survive for genuine free will, falling deeply in love with the very cages we cannot ever escape. The lighting shifts, throwing sharp shadows across Dante's face as he cements his absolute dominance. He introduces his syndicate, and the camera pushes tight on Ara's widening eyes. Standing right there is the man who assaulted her. All color drains from her face. Her mind violently blurs the horrific reality into a thick numbness. The men study her, silently branding her as the property of a crime boss. She knows the crushing weight of this ownership should suffocate her. Yet, her fractured psyche twists the sheer terror into a protective shield, believing this loss of freedom is the only way to stay breathing. It leaves us with a sobering lesson. When people are violently stripped of safety, they will desperately seek comfort in the exact hands that stole it. The scale of his empires settles over her like a suffocating blanket. With a careless flick of his wrist, Dante allows her to sit, managing her exhaustion as if she were merely another asset on his ledger. The camera pans to his cold expression. The false warmth he showed her has vanished. In its place stands the terrifying boss, ruthlessly crushing any trace of defiance. Instead of pulling away, Ara feels her trauma bond deepen. She finds a twisted pride in being chosen by the predator everyone else fears. As the room empties, Elena stays behind, warning Ara not to let this darkness rot her from the inside. But the tragedy is already moving. We learn a hard truth here. You cannot compromise with a highly toxic environment without slowly losing vital pieces of your own soul. Elena leans close, whispering that Dante is secretly a good man in a terrible business. Is a heartbreaking lie, the exact rationalization enablers build to excuse the unforgivable. When Dante returns, Ara's shoulders slump as she confesses her terror. His touch is calculated, rewarding her submission with a gentle stroke of her hair, cementing her into his shadow. The scene cuts to a warmly lit restaurant where the owner greets Dante warmly, painting a tragic illusion of a normal lunch. Ara clings to this soft lighting, pretending the blood on his hands simply does not exist. But reality remains quietly sinister. We must always remember one crucial thing. A moment of peace inside a toxic dynamic does not mean the danger is gone. It merely means the monster is resting. Let us look at this frame by frame, shall we? The camera pushes in as Ara asks us about the death of Dante's father. Dante's posture stays straight. There is no grief in his eyes, only a cold calculation of the crime empire he inherited. He admits early failures nearly destroyed everything. A rare crack in his armor he quickly covers with violent arrogance. When asked about regrets, his chilling indifference fills the quiet room. Ara, deeply lost in her tragic trauma bond, rushes in to blindly soothe the monster. She defends his brutal methods, painting his cruelty as a mere necessity for survival. The life lesson here is sad. We often mentally rewrite the morality of the people we are attached to just so we can survive the heavy psychological toll of standing beside them. The sun filters through gray clouds as they stroll through a quiet neighborhood. To any stranger, it looks like romance, but the camera pulls back, revealing Marco trailing them like a dark shadow. Dante walks among the innocent, an apex predator hiding in plain sight. He whispers to Ara that this invisibility is their shield. This is the moment her psychological tragedy sets in. After a lifetime of feeling broken, she finds a twisted comfort in his terrifying power. Standing next to the most lethal man in the city, she actually feels safe. It is a chilling picture of trauma. The human mind will contort itself into terrifying shapes just to feel protected. But true safety is always an illusion when your secure sanctuary is built by the very monster you should be running from. The heavy doors click shut as Dante leaves, giving Ara a fleeting moment of peace. The room fills with the mournful notes of the piano as she tries to reconnect with the innocent girl she used to be. But the illusion shatters the second he returns. He sits on the bench and forces his hands onto the keys, injecting his dark presence into her private refuge. Stick with me. You and I can see what this really is. It is not a tender romantic moment. The narcissist cannot allow his victim to experience a joy that does not belong to him. They share a soft laugh over a missed note, and the reality of her cage fades into the music. It leaves us with a painful thought. Genuine love requires giving someone the space to breathe and be themselves rather than aggressively consuming their world. Watch closely as the domestic illusion shatters. The phone ringing acts like a gunshot in the quiet room. Dante's posture instantly hardens, his jaw locks, and the warm lover is replaced by the calculating predator. A rival has burned a warehouse, and Ara's nervous system spikes with terror. She asks what he will do, though the devastating answer is already carved into the sharp lines of his face. Violence is his only language. He orders Marco to lock her away. As he turns to leave, she sees the absolute void in his eyes. Yet, entirely consumed by her trauma bond, she weeps and begs the monster to promise he will return to her. The tragic life lesson is clear. We often desperately seek our ultimate safety in the very roaring fires that will eventually burn us straight to the ground. Notice how he manipulates her attachment. His face softens, whispering a promise to return. It is a masterclass in securing blind loyalty before marching to war. He leaves her locked in the dark under Marco's watch. To the world, Marco is a bodyguard. Inside this tragedy, he is merely a warden. Left alone in the suffocating silence, Ara's mind begins to tear apart. Marco casually reminds her that Dante is the actual threat, sending her thoughts spiraling. She is paralyzed by terror for the predator, yet unable to survive without him. Every passing headlight across the wall feels like an executioner arriving. At 3 a.m, the heavy lock finally clicks open. The lesson is haunting. Total isolation will force the human mind to desperately crave the poison that is slowly killing it. Let us unpack this devastating pivot together. Ara races across the room, driven by raw desperation. Dante steps into the dim light, his shirt soaked in blood. A healthy mind would recoil, but Ara checks his body for wounds. His face is terrifyingly blank. With sociopathic detachment, he calmly announces he has slaughtered an entire rival syndicate. 12 lives erased in the dark. He looks into her eyes and weaponizes her guilt, claiming he committed this massacre solely to keep her safe. A rational person would run, but the trauma bond has rotted away her moral compass. Instead of screaming, she pulls the murderer tightly against her chest. The life lesson here is tragic. When we lose our fundamental sense of self, we will willingly build our homes inside the darkest of hearts. When looking back at this tragedy, we search for the frame where her fracture becomes permanent. For Ara, it begins with a trembling breath and a whispered apology. She cries into his blood-stained chest, saying she is sorry. It is the heartbreaking response of a hostage trying to placate a volatile captor. The words hang heavy in the dimly lit room, a bid to soothe the primal violence radiating from his skin. She is begging for forgiveness over a bloodbath she had no part in, laying the final bricks of her trauma bond. She wrongly believes that if she carries the weight of his sins, she can somehow tame the monster inside him. We must learn from her devastating mistake. You can never control someone else's inner darkness by taking the blame for the shadows they actively create. The camera catches the arrogant tilt of Dante's head as he asserts terrifying psychological control. "Do not be," he commands softly. With those words, he brutally strips away the last shred of her emotional agency. This was always coming. You were just the excuse. Notice the chilling grandiosity echoing in his tone. He absolves her of the guilt, while shrinking her worth down to nothingness. He paints his homicidal rage as an unstoppable force of nature, making certain she understands. The predator inside him was always awake, simply waiting for a convenient trigger. The screen fades to black on her devoted eyes, leaving us with one haunting realization. The cruelest monsters in this world do not just break your spirit. They completely convince you that you begged them to do it. The camera pushes in close. We see an apex predator feigning a fatal wound. His shoulders slump in defeat. He buries his face into the soft strands of Ara's hair, the harsh lighting suddenly feeling like a confessional. "I need a shower," he whispers, his voice carefully hollowed out. Today, you and I are going to unpack this terrible moment together. By playing the broken man, he forces her empathy to completely silence her survival instincts. She swallows hard, nodding slowly. "Okay," she murmurs. In her traumatized eyes, he is no longer a violent monster, dripping with the consequences of murder. He is just a wounded man who needs her love. Here is the tragic truth we must learn. The most dangerous cages are the exact ones we willingly unlock for the broken people we deeply pity. Let us step into this room together. The air is suffocating, choking on the sharp copper smell of fresh blood. As Dante pulls back, the grim reality slowly bleeds into Ara's vision. Wet crimson ruins his shirt, clinging to his massive hands like a terrible second skin. This is the raw wreckage of intimate slaughter. A rational person would scream. A normal survivor would bolt for the door and never look back. But the camera lingers on Ara, absolutely frozen. Her mind violently shuts down the horror, wrapping her fragile psyche in a freezing blanket of pure shock. We learn a quiet, devastating truth here. When the human heart simply cannot digest the nightmare standing right in front of it, the mind will quickly build a fortress of solid ice just to survive the dark. "Join me," he whispers, the dark command wearing the perfect mask of a gentle plea. Pay attention to the visual framing in this psychological moment. This is completely devoid of romance. A shattered man like Dante simply refuses to stand alone with the screaming ghosts of the men he just ruined. He desperately needs a pure anchor to stop his own soul from drowning in absolute black. By dragging Ara into the suffocating steam, he forces her to physically scrub the guilt from his skin. Her bare hands are now forced to carry the ugly stain of his survival. We are watching a toxic bond forming entirely against her will. The life lesson here is harsh but undeniably true. When you decide to help a deeply dangerous man wash away his sins, you inevitably end up wearing his heavy guilt as your own. They stand beneath the punishing heat of the scalding water, trapped in a suffocating silence. The camera pans down to the metal drain at their feet. The hot water spirals away in thick ribbons of dark red, slowly fading into a bruised pink before running clear. Ara's shaking hands move mechanically over his back, scrubbing away the violent evidence of his brutality. He stands perfectly still, with his eyes closed, absorbing her touch like a fallen king demanding devotion. This is a devastating portrait of psychological submission. She is actively washing away the horror, making his madness acceptable. Always remember this crucial lesson. The moment you start cleaning up the wreckage of someone else's cruelty, you quietly accept it as a permanent fixture in your own life. Once the brutal residue of the slaughter vanishes, a fragile illusion of safety creeps back into the room. The harsh light casts long shadows across the dripping tiles. Dante steps out without a word, leaving Ara shivering under the fading heat. Her hollow eyes stare blankly at the spotless porcelain, fighting to unsee the terrible things she just touched. The literal blood is entirely gone, but the invisible stain now crushes her own shoulders. She dries her skin in total silence, drifting like a ghost trapped inside a house she can never escape. This reveals a simple, tragic truth we often learn far too late. You can completely wash away the physical evidence of a terrible night, but the deep emotional trauma will remain to stain your hands forever. You and I are going to unpack this together. This is the precise frame where the steel trap violently snaps shut. Dante sneaks behind her back, forging her admission to an elite academic institute. When her anger flares up, he instantly drops down to one knee. Notice how the stark lighting suddenly softens. He looks up from a beautifully calculated, submissive angle, claiming he only wants to restore her broken dreams. He promises to cover the massive tuition and secure her future. Ara stands completely overwhelmed, her sharp fury melting into a tragic puddle of gratitude. She falsely believes she has won her ultimate freedom, totally blind to the cold iron bars locking into place. Here is a harsh reality of human nature. Total control very often wears the beautiful, sparkling mask of romantic generosity. Look closely at how her deepest ambitions are weaponized against her. She hungers for independence, and the poisoned bait is simply too sweet to decline. The second she whispers her surrender, a victorious smirk pulls at his lips. He casually mentions she will be staying with him for a long time. Tragically, She mistakes this terrifying declaration of ownership for a passionate vow of true love. The visual edit cuts between her two fractured realities. By day, she sits in sunlit lecture halls, safely debating classical art. By night, she crawls into the heavy silk sheets of a crime boss who commands bloody violence with the flick of a wrist. The lesson is painfully clear for anyone watching. Trying to sustain a fractured double life will inevitably split your fragile soul right down the middle. The wide shot pulls back to reveal Ara sitting at a bustling campus cafe. She is surrounded by chatter, yet she has never looked more alone. Her classmates sit in the warm sun, complaining about trust funds and weekend parties. Ara pastes on a fake smile, nodding and along while hiding the ticking bomb in her chest. When a girl leans in, jokingly guessing that Ara must be in witness protection, the blood instantly drains from Ara's face. She forces out a hollow, engineered laugh. Panic rising, she quickly shifts the topic to her old days serving diner food to throw them off the scent. She is burying her authentic self to shield the man keeping her trapped. We must always remember this truth. Guarding a toxic secret will inevitably demand the slow, quiet sacrifice of your true identity. Ara wanders back through the fading light, painfully aware that the laughing students passing by cannot fathom the brutal underworld commanded by Dante. When she steps through the doors of his dimly lit penthouse, the true tragedy of her captivity hits its peak. Bone-tired from wearing a false face all day, she collapses into the embrace of the exact man who is destroying her life. Dante slowly strokes her hair. His voice drops into a commanding rumble as he strictly forbids her from ever revealing the truth. He masterfully spins her isolation into a breathtaking, dark romance, whispering elegant lies about his violent empire to calm her racing pulse. You and I need to recognize the massive danger right here. Seeking comfort from the very person who engineers your pain is a guaranteed way to lose yourself completely in the dark. The cinematic lens shifts, plunging us into the freezing reality of his manipulation. Dante paces the floor like a predator. His movements are sharp, actively testing the limits of her blind loyalty. He provokes her, mentioning that his associates doubt her as mental toughness. When Ara defends her chin, claiming she knows exactly what he is, Dante brutally shatters her illusion. He steps in close, verbally forcing her to imagine the freezing steel of a loaded gun pressed flush against her temple. He demands to know her plan for the day. His enemies finally kick down her door. The color instantly leaves her face as the romantic fog evaporates, leaving behind only paralyzing terror. The stark life lesson here is clear. Ignoring the early red flags in a relationship only guarantees that you will eventually have to face the storm without any shelter. Stick with me here, because this is where the tragedy sets itself in permanent stone. Dante steps back, offering her an open door to run away. It is a rigged game. He knows he has already locked the psychological cage around her mind. Ara does not run. Instead, she steps closer. Her shaking hands reach up to cup his face, passionately vowing she will never abandon him. He pulls her into a desperate kiss, hiding his own terrified need for her total submission. As winter freezes the city, her internal ruin begins bleeding out into her academic work. She designs a brilliant art exhibit that violently clashes classical martyrs against stark modern cruelty. It is a stunning, silent visual scream for help. This teaches us a deeply crucial truth. The human mind will always find a creative way to express the profound trauma we refuse to speak aloud. The warmth of the art studio is swallowed by stark, sleepless shadows. Ara buries herself beneath mountains of canvas and research, surviving purely on empty adrenaline and stale coffee. The camera watches her move with a frantic, desperate energy. Dante quietly leans against the doorway. His eyes track her downward spiral with a twisted fascination before he steps inside, taking the paintbrush from her hand like a concerned father. But the damage is done. Ara's mind is fractured. She stares up at him with hollow eyes, convinced she must work herself to the bone just to repay the money he forced upon her. She is actively trading her sanity for his toxic approval. This serves as a powerful warning. Burning yourself out just to prove your basic worth to a manipulative partner will inevitably destroy everything beautiful about you. The vibration of her phone shatters the quiet afternoon. A single text from Dante, the illusion of romance drops dead, replaced by the freezing bark of a mob boss backed into a corner. He tells her to be afraid, weaponizing her raw panic to guarantee immediate obedience. His enforcer pulls up to the curb. Ara dives into the tinted black sedan, the heavy metallic thud of the locks sealing her fate. As the car tears through the streets, she does not shed a tear for her lost independence. She does not scream at the madness. She merely stares into the rearview mirror and quietly asks if Dante's rival has returned to murder them. Her entire moral universe has shrunk down to keeping her captor breathing. This leaves us with a haunting lesson. Accepting continuous chaos into your life will eventually destroy your internal compass for right and wrong. Let us look at this final frame together, because we are watching the absolute end of the line. Ara is dragged into a stark, windowless room, severed entirely from the outside world. Dante waits in the shadows. He pulls her into an embrace so crushing, it forces the air from her lungs, checking her face with the cold eyes of a man inspecting his most expensive property. He whispers that dodging bullets is simply how he lives, twisting the terror of the night to prove his violent worldview was right. Ara just stands there, her hands shaking so violently she cannot keep them still. The heavy door is bolted shut. The light fades out. The truth of this tragedy is simple. Trading your own freedom for the promise of protection will always leave you defenseless in the dark. The camera lingers quietly on the immediate wreckage of a human soul. Ara stands with her chest heaving in distress, whispering a frantic fear of losing him. It is a classic echo of psychological surrender, where her entire universe shrinks to the mere silhouette of her captor. Dante remains in the shadows, a man completely unable to stomach his own failure. Look at the cold lighting hitting his tense jaw. You will find no relief in his eyes, only a glacial vow to destroy the rival who exposed his weakness. His hollow voice sends a primal shiver down her spine, a biological warning she tragically misreads as profound devotion. It is a harsh reality of human nature that we often mistake the fire that warms us for the fire that will ultimately burn our house to the ground. Notice how the camera frames this agonizing isolation. Dante leaves at dawn to enact his vengeance, his voice flat as he orders Ara to stay hidden. He controls her every breath while he bathes the city streets in violence. Hour by hour, she simply paces the floor. Her panic is not for her freedom, but for the safe return of the man who locked her in. When Dante finally stumbles back at 3 in the morning, his arm is dislocated and his clothes are heavy with blood. Still, his pride refuses to break. He rejects a hospital, choosing criminal secrecy over his failing body. By forcing Ara to kneel as his caregiver, he binds her directly to his survival. We frequently bleed the most for the exact people who hand us the blade. The lens captures the terrifying weight of her quiet compliance. Any rational person would bolt for the door, but Ara silences her instinct to scream for help, completely crushed by his heavy stare. As her trembling fingers bandage his deep cuts, her eerie calm gives away a fragile mental defense. While she works, Dante clinically recounts the massacre of the night. He describes executing his rival and every single witness with a flat tone, entirely empty of remorse. When she nervously asks if the violence will ever end, his response freezes the air in the room. "There is always another enemy," he whispers. In his fractured mind, this never-ending war justifies his absolute control over her existence. It is a sad truth that fear will always build the tallest, most inescapable prisons. Stick with me here, because the story now pivots into absolute darkness. Dante openly outlines the brutal violence of his empire, stating his nature will never change. Consciously, Ara sees the madness of it all. She is wiping the sweat off a mass murderer. She knows she should run. Yet, the deep roots of her condition choke out any sense of self-preservation. She presses her lips against the predator's forehead, swearing her total loyalty. When a shadow medic arrives to fix the torn shoulder, the colder detachment in the room makes the nightmare feel totally normal. He tells Ara to manage the recovery. She gently guides the medicated crime boss to bed, fully embracing her role as his accomplice. We must never forget that our most destructive choices often wear the mask of love. The camera pushes in close to examine the deep sickness of her affection. Ara sits quietly by the bed, tracing the physical marks of his brutality. She stares at the dark bruises and the jagged stitches, actively weaving this violence into her romanticized view of his soul. She convinces herself that his narcissistic cage is actually a fortress of profound love. This quiet acceptance marks her complete psychological defeat. When his eyes finally open, Dante puts on a fake display of guilt, softly suggesting she should run away. It is nothing but a cruel test of her conditioning. Ara immediately silences him, pressing her warm hand to his cold lips. She has fully accepted his violent reality as her own. We truly lose our identity the second we start falling in love with our own chains. In an agonizing close-up, Ara burns her final bridge to sanity, whispering that she understands exactly what he is. She completely forgives his monstrous nature. For a man obsessed with power, this is the ultimate victory. He is being worshipped because of his terrible deeds, not despite them. Dante grips her face hard, demanding eternal possession. He promises to keep her forever, handing down a life sentence wrapped up as a romantic vow. They exchange breathless confessions, mistaking their shared terror for genuine intimacy. They stay hidden in this dark bunker for 3 full days, totally cut off from the sun. When they finally emerge, they walk like soldiers returning from a bitter war. The most dangerous lies in life are always the ones we build together in the dark. You and I must look at how this trauma bleeds into the light of day. Ara channels her broken mind directly onto the canvas. She paints the clash of violence and beauty, turning her life with the crime boss into art. Her mentors praise the dark painting as a masterpiece, totally blind that they are clapping for an active hostage situation. When a friend asks about her inspiration, Ara's eyes turn to stone. She vaguely blames it on life, fiercely guarding her reality. The air in the room shifts when Dante arrives with his armed guards. He walks through her normal world like an untouchable predator. His mere presence is a suffocating show of power, cleverly disguised as the quiet of a loving partner. We often hang our deepest wounds in plain sight for everyone to miss. Dante stands quietly before her painting, comparing her creation on the canvas to his own criminal destruction. By pulling her dark art up to his level, He makes sure his approval remains the only thing she values. Over the next few months, their lives fall into a twisted pattern of chaotic stability. They fight bitterly about his violent world, yet the sudden flashes of his warm affection keep her tightly chained. The constant paranoia of his empire becomes her new normal. Soon he plans a return to the exact restaurant where he first captured her attention. It is a heavy, symbolic moment that kicks off the final phase of his control. Under the dim dining lights, he slides a small box across the table. Ara just stares at it. The saddest truth is that perfect captivity often feels exactly like destiny. We now witness the final blow to her mind. Dante admits he is a danger she should run from, yet he demands her permanent submission anyway. He uses his own sickness as a tool, dressing his violent obsession as a tragic romance. Ara looks at the heavy diamond ring not as a shackle, but as a shiny trophy of their survival. She eagerly says yes. As he slips the cold metal onto her finger, the camera lingers on the formal sealing of their bond. He whispers that he does not deserve her, a classic trick that forces his own victim to comfort him. When they announce the engagement to his crime family, a captain praises Ara as braver than a soldier. The loud applause normalizes her descent into a mental prison. Even the most beautiful cages are built specifically to break your wings. Jenna enters the story to give us a vital anchor to the real world. She represents pure, objective reality, pointing out the fatal risk of marrying a crime boss. Watch Ara's defense mechanisms kick into overdrive. She minimizes the danger, arguing that 6 chaotic months with a killer mean more than a lifetime of safety. She defends her captor by clinging to his rare moments of gentleness, falsely believing she still has free will. In reality, Dante holds total control, hiding his iron grip behind the illusion of fierce protection. He has convinced his victim that she is the center of his universe. Tragically, worn down by the sheer force of this delusion, even her rational friend eventually gives up and stops fighting. Our deep hunger to feel loved will frequently blind us to our own utter destruction. The wedding introduces Dante's sister, the very last voice of sanity. She understands his sick mind with cold precision. Notice the heavy tension when she pulls the bride aside to offer an immediate escape route. She knows that terror often wears the mask of affection. Yet, Ara rejects the open door. She grabs a hold of her own captivity, actively choosing the fire. We are watching a captive passionately fighting for her right to stay locked in the cage. Defeated, the sister steps back, issuing a dark threat against her own brother as a final layer of insurance. They marry in an isolated garden surrounded by men with guns. We are not watching a celebration of love today. We are watching the permanent securing of a willing hostage. The darkest prisons in life are always locked from the inside. Let us examine their vows the way a psychologist would. Ara talks about choosing love over fear, convincing herself the constant danger around her is normal. Dante promises absolute protection, slipping into the role of an all-powerful guardian. The wedding reception is an echo chamber of people praising her bravery. Later, she finds Dante staring over the dark city he rules, admitting he feels terrified. But you and I need to understand the pathology. A true narcissist does not fear losing a person, they fear losing control of their prize. Those wedding bands are not symbols of devotion, but markers of ownership. The lesson here is simple and sharp. A predator might use the word love, but to them, a ring is never a promise. It is just a heavy, expensive chain. Look closely at the framing of this scene. The shadows literally cling to Ara. She sits waiting for the next disaster, her shoulders tight with panic. Dante just stands in the warm light, his complex making him feel invincible. Soon after, she gets a gallery job, and he quietly buys her a private studio. It looks like romance, but notice the cold blocking on screen. He hands her a tiny piece of independence to guarantee her loyalty. The predator softens his steps. He sits at the grand piano, letting beautiful music hide his violent empire, talking about going legitimate. Do not fall for the elegant lighting. The life lesson here is bitter. A cornered monster never actually seeks true redemption. They simply change their camouflage so they can keep hunting in plain sight. The camera pushes in tight on Dante. The silver at his temples shows the heavy toll of a violent life. He plans an exit strategy, knowing an assassin will catch up with him eventually. He asks Ara if she wants a clean life, spinning his survival into a grand romantic gesture. Over the next 2 years, he sells off his underworld empire, buying into real estate and shipping companies. He claims the old Dante is dead and buried. But through the director's lens, we see the real truth. He just traded dark alleyways for cold boardrooms. He uses the same ruthless psychology, just legally. Ara stays anchored to him, mistaking a tactical retreat for a healed soul. The life lesson we can all take away is simple. A predator wrapped in an expensive suit is still a creature born to hunt. Stay with me, because the visual blocking of this sequence is tragically poetic. Alara opens a major art exhibition centered on violence, putting her deepest trauma on public display. Dante has completely washed his bad reputation, hiding his crime family behind shiny corporate logos. On the night of her big triumph, the gallery finally empties out. Watch the subtle shift in his posture. He steps uncomfortably close and steals her victory, whispering how he personally buried every single obstacle in her path. And heaven help her, she actually looks up and thanks him. The agonizing life lesson here is impossible to ignore. When you owe your greatest success to a very dangerous person, you have not actually found freedom. You have just traded a rusty iron cage for a shiny golden one. The visual contrast in this frame is deeply haunting. Standing among painted scenes of destruction, they ask one another if they are truly happy. Without hesitation, both whisper yes. They have romanticized their nightmares, treating a bloody history of cruelty like a beautiful, shared struggle. Alara looks down at his hands. These are the same hands that ordered murders, but now they just play the piano. She actually believes she has cured a broken man. It is the tragic climax of a savior complex crashing right into Stockholm Syndrome. She sees his new corporate job as proof of his devotion. But the brutal life lesson here is clear. You can never love the poison out of a venomous snake. A predator just learns to hunt in a softer place, to keep his prize asleep in his arms. You and I must look at this final act to see the real tragedy. 5 years after their lives collided, the camera finds them sharing a massive estate built on shared delusion. Alara reveals everything through her posture. She accepts her role as the fragile woman saved by a monster who somehow found his humanity. Out on the sunlit porch, Dante leans in and asks if she has any regrets, pulling invisible strings to test his control. Looking at the horizon, she calls their survival cosmic luck, completely blind to the dark trauma that actually bound them together. They truly believe their broken pieces fit perfectly, but the story leaves us with a sober life lesson. Sometimes, the quiet peace we desperately call a cure is really just the silent symptom of a fatal disease. As the screen fades to black, we witness the ultimate tragedy of their story. What started as a simple dropped glass in a restaurant has grown into a suffocating existence, Watch how they physically cling to each other against that city skyline. They actually define this deep sickness as true love. They convince themselves two fractured souls could somehow make a healthy whole just by carrying their heavy darkness together. As the city hums far below, Dante wraps his arms around her in a heavy, totally inescapable embrace. It leaves us with one final, haunting life lesson. The human heart is so starved for real connection that it will normalize absolute chaos. It will gladly paint the cold iron bars of its own prison in the warm colors of romance and call it a beautiful victory.